Well, good morning. It's so glad to have you. So good to have you back for Bible study this morning as we are continuing on through our journey of outsiders. And we are in 24 days of looking at outsiders over 6 weeks. And each of these outsiders have brought something special, something incredible to the community, mostly positive from the outside, but occasionally it's a cautionary tale. Well, my name is Kevin Young. I have the privilege of serving at Christ Table as lead clergy. If you would like to know more about Christ Table, who we are, what we do, I'd encourage you to visit that URL that is right up there, www.christstable.today. Sign up for our email list there. Lots of things go on around here, and we give lots of things away. One of the things that we're giving away for absolutely free is a Bible study guide to help you navigate this journey along with us through outsiders. You can download that PDF right at the URL at the bottom of your screen, go.christstable.today/outsiders. Now, I'll tell you that if you go there and do that, we would appreciate that a lot. There's also an opportunity for you to receive more resources if you want that. It doesn't necessarily need you don't need to do that in order to be a part of the Bible study, but it does help us continue to bring these to you if you find them helpful. And this is one of the better Bible studies for me, actually, because I have enjoyed really kind of recognizing that in those moments where I have felt like an outsider from a religious community, whenever I felt like I don't fit in, whenever I've been told I don't fit in, whenever I have been, even in moments, surprisingly, I know, pushed to the outside of worshiping religious communities of faith, there is just this great, there's this great image of being an outsider in Scripture being a positive thing. And we have this kind of historical thread that runs through Scripture where God just kind of continually says, where Jesus continually actually lives out this idea that being with outsiders is really usually and almost always the primary place where you're going to find God and where you're going to find Jesus Christ is with those who are outside of these sometimes ultra pious, religious, self-centered, self-focused communities. Not all of them are like that, but they have a tendency to become that, right? Whenever you are feeling as though you're on the inside of something, it creates this elitism. It creates this identity where you feel like where I am better than others, where I am loved more than others. And that is counter to the gospel. Today, we're going to meet an outsider who was from birth an outsider from all communities in all ways. Blind man. We're going to meet this blind man in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. And one of the things about John is kind of difficult, but it's difficult because it's kind of a literary masterpiece. John is a master worker at weaving story and narrative together with theological ideas and moving a story along in kind of specific theological ways. And so this story really comes at a very important hinge point in Scripture where it's kind of a bit of a rerun miracle from another miracle just a few chapters before. It's a hinge that pulls together chapter 8. So I'm not going to read through all of chapter 9, but I'll tell you, if you kind of want to get the full picture of what's going on here in this section and you have extra time, I'd encourage you to back up into chapter 8, read through the entirety of chapter 9, and verse 41 is the end of chapter 9, and just kind of get the entire story. And this story is a dramatic story that is almost Shakespearean in nature, and the roller coaster that it goes on and the way John weaves the story. But at the center of all of this is a blind man, and it's very difficult for me to fully communicate in modern times how much of an outsider you were immediately by having any kind of disability. cognitive disability, physical disability. There was no American with Disabilities Act. There was no sense in religious communities, or most religious communities, of a responsibility to people who had disabilities. Now, we do know that there were the Essenes who were on the scene. Those are the folks, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you may have heard of that. It came out of that community. And they helped these down and outers with physical and oftentimes cognitive disabilities, but they were very rare because from the religious worshiping communities in the first century, if you had a disability, there was a reason for your disability. There was just kind of this ancient Bronze Age kind of idea that if you had an abnormality like this individual with blindness, that you deserved it, that it was given to you because of something you had done in your life. But this one in chapter 9 of John was there from birth. So it was likely something that his parents had done in people's estimation. And so families didn't want to have anything to do with children who had disabilities because it was a reflection upon them. They felt guilt and shame for something that they had done, whether they could identify what it was or not, that they thought it was tied to. Everybody thought that it was the judgment of God upon them or upon the person for this thing. And so you were literally on your own, left to beg. Even if your family was rich and could take care of you, more often than not, they would not. And we see this multiple times in scripture with the people who Jesus interacts with and heals were on their own, not because they didn't have families, but because their families had rejected them. Forced outsiders. You may have a physical disability. You may have a cognitive disability and understand what it is like to be a forced outsider for many communities because of that. Multiply that by being rejected fully by your family and by everybody in society and in your community with absolutely no accommodations. You're on your own to beg for enough to survive and to live. And people in those days did not typically tend to be as generous as they are today. At least from what we understand historically from the narrative. So when we come to John chapter 9, Jesus is walking along. This is during the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Tabernacles was a yearly, an annual celebration of the time when the Israelites were in the desert and lived in tents, lived in tabernacles, lived in makeshift abodes. So there was this whole ceremony that went along with this that involved water. And that's kind of understandable because the original Exodus happened in a wilderness and water was central to the theme and to the blessing and healing of that difficulty. 40 years in the wilderness, water is central in that story. And so water is central as well in the remembrance of the Feast of the Tabernacles that is taking place whenever Jesus is walking along. So he sees a man who has been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples ask him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? So the difficulty wasn't whether or not the sins were judgments from God in the mind of those who were closest to Jesus, but the difficulty was, how do we determine? How do we determine who is at fault here? And isn't this like just normal for religious communities? Isn't this just, whose fault is this? It's not, how do we solve this problem? It's not, let's just move on from the issue at hand. It's not, we're here where we are, let's try to fix it from here. No, it's who do we get to blame? Blame. Why? Shame. Why? Guilt. Why? Tends to be human nature. And sadly, human nature seems to be never more on display than in religious worshiping communities. Gandhi. I love Jesus. I just don't like his people, right? So why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. Jesus answered, "You fools." Jesus doesn't say that. That's me just kind of inserting there. WTH, what the heck, guys? Like, it's not because of his sins or his parents' sins. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned to us, but let's get this man healed. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here in the world, I am the light of the world. It was actually Sabbath, and so Jesus wasn't supposed to be doing any of this anyway. But Jesus, he's a rebel. I want to stop here though, because in that verse, if you saw it, in fact, let me go back here for just a moment. It wasn't because of his sins or his parents' sins. This happens so the power of God can be seen in him. And there's this phrasing that seems to imply that he was made blind by God intentionally so that Jesus could have this moment. No. I cannot rebuke that idea enough, and I can't rebuke the language of the Greek enough that it doesn't actually say that in Greek. Can you read it that way in Greek? Yes, you can read it in that way in Greek, but there is an equally and better way to read and understand that in the original language that does not blame God for intentionally doing this just so that Jesus can have a rock star moment here in front of his disciples. No, God did not create him broken to prove his power. Don't be an idiot. No. God's power will be proven in this moment. And that statement about God proving his power actually doesn't go with the previous with sins. It actually goes with the next. We must quickly carry out the task. God's power is going to be seen in him because we are about to do something about it. God did not create him broken to prove his power. And I would say, actually, if I'm thinking about this, God's power is proven in him in the way he has lived and survived through his brokenness, through his disability, through his trauma. It wasn't the fact that there was a disability to be healed here that proves and shows God's power. It is that this guy still is alive. Is that this guy still has a belief in God. It's that this individual is still walking and moving and functioning despite all of the trauma that he is carrying. That is what proves God's power. It's how he's wrestled with this. And so often whenever I see people who have gone through trauma, whenever I see people who are living with disabilities, living with struggles, whether they be cognitive or physical or emotional or any number of other disabling factors and traumas that come into our lives. I see God's power oftentimes not so much in the healing or the taking away of those things, but in the way that those things are carried. To me, that's God's power on display. Sadly, many religious people just don't see it that way. In those days, healing and medical diagnoses and things they didn't know what we know today. They thought that spit carried some sort of magical properties. So Jesus spits on the ground, makes it into mud with saliva, spreads the mud over the man's eyes, and he tells him, "Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam." Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. I don't have time to get into this. Feel free to Google if you want. But this pool, this washing, this idea that the pool is called sent is very much tied into the Feast of the Tabernacles. This is a primary part of what's going on during this week of annual celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so there's a reason why Jesus sends him to this place and why we are reminded that this pool is called sent. But I'm going to move on. So the man goes, he washes, he comes back, he sees, and his neighbors and others who knew him as the blind beggar asked each other, "Isn't this the man that used to sit and beg?" Some said he was. Others said, "No, it just looks like him." But the beggar kept saying, "No, that's me. I'm the man. I couldn't see before, and now I can. And so they ask him, who healed you? What happened? What is going on here? So he tells them, a man that they called Jesus came and made mud. He spreads it over his eyes. He tells me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and I washed myself, and now I can see. Now, I am just at the very beginning of the story, but I am fully running out of time here. So I'm going to encourage you to continue reading the rest of this chapter from here on, and it gets crazy because the Pharisees and religious leaders get involved, the parents get involved. They're trying to prove that Jesus did something that he shouldn't have done by working on the Sabbath. They're trying to get the parents to admit that this happened and that it was Jesus who did it, but the parents can't admit that Jesus did it, because if they admit that Jesus did it, then they know that there's this conspiracy to kick anybody out of the synagogue, to essentially shun them and remove them from the blessing of the community if anybody has anything to do whatsoever with Jesus. And so they kick the ball back to the once disabled son. Is like, well, that kid means nothing to us, so let's get him kicked out rather than us get kicked out. And it goes back and forth, and they all get called in a second time after one interrogation, and it's just drama. When all of it's over, there's this moment at the end of the chapter between Jesus and his disciples where there is this connection that is made from Jesus about physical blindness, but spiritual blindness being a thing, and maybe even worse than physical blindness. And it's fascinating. If you look at Jesus throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, kind of the primary miracle that Jesus does is healing blindness, like over and over and over again. If you're going to count them up, there are somewhere close to a dozen, like there's a lot, it's not one or two, healings of people who are blind in one way or the other. Sometimes it's just by speaking, sometimes it's by mud, sometimes it's scales falling. Like there are multiple things that happen here. Even Paul was healed of a blindness. So there seems to be this narrative where we are supposed to see that even though we may or may not be physically blind, there is a propensity, a potential for us to be spiritually blind. And that it could be worse because physically blind people see they're blind. They understand and know their blindness, right? And everybody around them sees and understands and knows their blindness. The difficulty with spiritual blindness is, sadly, it is often, usually, always unseen. And sometimes those people who are spiritually blind, I might even say that I feel like oftentimes whenever people are spiritually blind, those around them actually not only do they not see the spiritual blindness in the person who they are following or allowing them to lead, but they actually elevate them. This is a difficulty in religious circles. The inability to recognize and see and adequately deal with spiritual blindness. And it's a problem. So Jesus, and we'll kind of end with this verse, says here, I entered the world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they're blind. So oftentimes I think that what we do is we focus on the first part of that. We focus on I enter this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind and to those who think they see they're blind. When we think judgment, and we think of something negative from that. But I read this, and what I see is that whenever we see this word judgment, I enter this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind. That's a positive or affirming judgment. Think about that for just a moment, because we still have this lens where judgment is negative. And what Jesus says, hey, I came into the world to enter judgment, and hey, it's Publishers Clearinghouse. Y'all are getting free stuff here. This is The Price is Right, and you are on Showcase Showdown, and you have won been watching old episodes of Price is Right with Bob Barker in our house recently. But I came in this world to judge, and my judgment is I'm going to give you sight. I'm going to heal the issues that are standing in the way of you being an insider. I'm going to wipe away those things that are causing you to be, to feel, to live on the outside of community. And those who think that they see, those who think they're good, those who don't recognize or admit that they're blind too, I'm going to help show them they're blind, if anybody can. Some do. Some end up seeing. Others don't. Fascinating thing is every single person that Jesus interacts with that is physically blind gains sight. Not everyone who Jesus interacts with that is spiritually blind wakes up and is able to see. I don't want to say anything about one being better or worse than the other, physical blindness or spiritual blindness. That would be a very ableist road to take. But I'll tell you, if you think that just because you can see, that you are in a good place and have nothing to worry about, Jesus says, you know what? There are lots of kinds of blindness in the world. And those who have sight may be the most blind. I want to say one more thing before we go. And like I said, I know that I have gone, what is the time here? I have gone lengthy, but I want to say one more thing here because I don't get a chance to talk about this a lot. And as a pastor over the years, I will say that I have failed so often in this because I'm not blind, because I don't have a visible physical disability or a debilitating cognitive disability or some other thing that stands in the way of me functioning in the world in a way that is perceived as being normal. Many of us, even though we have disabilities and abnormalities, are able to hide or mask those things in order to get by. Others are not. And the church has not always been and is not even today a safe place or a helpful place for people in those places. One of the things that sadly I have only become in tune to after working primarily outside of a physical worship space is how awful it is for those with disabilities or challenges to participate in physical worship in physical space whenever they want to. Doors are open, accommodations aren't made. They are made to continually feel as though they are an outsider, and it is wrong. I would say that probably the group that is most outside of the church today isn't atheists or even those with spiritual blindness. It is those with physical difficulties, physical blindness, physical challenges, emotional challenges, cognitive challenges. And the church intentionally, because it doesn't want to deal with the difficulties of making accommodations or asking people to be uncomfortable and allowing into their space people who struggle with autism, people who struggle with physical disabilities, people who struggle with cognitive disabilities, and families. And it's wrong. And so my final challenge here for us as individuals is to wrestle with those in our community who may have been shoved outside of sight, but who deserve and need to be a part of the faith community in relationship with you, even outside of the church, with me, even outside of the church, and our accommodations made. Or do we ignore it push them into hiding, push them out of the church, make no accommodations, because it's far easier for us to say there are many other people who might be offended, might not like it, might feel uncomfortable, might not know how to handle. So we're just going to kind of ignore that this is an issue. It's an issue and the church needs to face it. There are far too many outsiders who have been placed there intentionally, and we, the church, need to fix it. Until tomorrow, happy reading.